Have you ever wondered what a person becomes when love is torn from them piece by piece? Alabama, 1834, a world draped in cotton fields and suffocating silence. Beneath the surface of its southern gentility, the ground trembled with secrets, rage, and broken families. And in one small plantation house, a woman named Rebecca was pushed to the very edge of her humanity. So I ask you, what would you do if someone tried to erase the people you loved most? This was not one single crime. It was a system that fed on bodies, tore apart marriages, and sold children like livestock. Rebecca's tragedy was not unique, but what she did with her pain was. Because when her husband was sold away and her children's safety was threatened, she made a choice few dared to even imagine. And it would stain her master's legacy with blood. This isn't just a story of the past, it's an echo of truth still vibrating through history's silence. If you've found yourself leaning in, heart pounding, then I'm asking you, don't just watch, join this investigation. Subscribe to Echoes of Truth, so together we can unearth the shadows others would rather forget, because Rebecca's act of final resistance deserves to be remembered. Now I want you to picture Alabama in 1834, not the postcard version, not the manicured plantation houses shown in paintings, but the living, breathing land itself. The air was heavy, almost wet, clinging to every breath. In summer, cicadas screamed from the trees while the stench of sweat, soil, and animal waste lingered over the cotton rows. Nights brought no relief, only the hum of mosquitoes and the creak of old wood beneath candlelight. This was a society ruled by fear and performance. White families clung to the illusion of gentility, hosting Sunday gatherings, quoting scripture, and polishing silver tea sets. But that same silver was carried on the backs of those who had no freedom to rest. Enslaved men and women bent under the sun, their songs muffled, their grief silenced by the crack of the overseer's whip. Families were fragile things here. Never fully safe, never fully won. A mother could tuck her child to sleep in the evening and wake to find them sold by dawn. The economy depended on this cruelty. Cotton was king, and every hand that picked it was treated as both property and threat. The law reinforced it, churches excused it, and the marketplace thrived on it. To speak against slavery here was to invite ruin, exile, or worse. And yet, beneath the surface, the enslaved whispered prayers, carved memories, and held on to love as the last proof of their humanity. This was the world Rebecca lived in, a world that demanded silence from her, but also a world that unknowingly forged her resolve. Because within this suffocating landscape of profit and pain, she was about to make a decision that no one expected, and that decision would shatter the mask of Southern gentility forever. On paper, Master William Grayson was the picture of Southern respectability. He stood tall at church, his Bible worn from use, his manners precise. To neighbors, he was the sort of man who tipped his hat to ladies and donated generously to sermons about morality. At county meetings, he spoke with the smoothness of a man certain the world belonged to him. But behind those walls, William's respectability was nothing more than costume. He carried himself as a man of discipline, a patriarch who believed order and hierarchy were divine law. In truth, his discipline was cruelty wrapped in ritual. A sharp look from him could silence an entire room of enslaved workers, not because of respect, but because they knew what followed disobedience. He believed himself a guardian of civilization. And in that belief, he justified every lash of the whip, every child sold, every family torn apart. Standing beside him was his younger brother, Elias Grayson. Unlike William, Elias did not thrive on attention. He was not the voice of the family, but the hand that held the ledger. Thin, sharp-featured, and quietly calculating, Elias turned human lives into numbers, profits, and debts recorded in neat ink. He did not rage. He did not curse. His cruelty was colder, the kind that came without emotion at all. If William embodied arrogance, Elias embodied indifference. Together, they formed a perfect machinery, one fueled by entitlement, the other by arithmetic. The community around them applauded their wealth, never asking what it cost, and that silence, that willful blindness, was their greatest disguise. To the outside world, the Graysons were gentlemen of Alabama, but to Rebecca, and to every soul beneath their roof, they were architects of suffering. And soon, Rebecca would become the crack in their flawless facade. To the outside world, the Grayson plantation was a model of Southern success. Visitors were greeted by white columns, a manicured lawn, and the faint perfume of magnolia blossoms drifting through the air. The grand house itself gleamed like a monument to refinement. Polished silver on the dining table, portraits of stern ancestors on the walls, hymns humming faintly from the parlor. This was the mask. The Graysons cultivated it carefully, presenting themselves as protectors of tradition, guardians of a civilized order. At church, William Grayson would speak of his household as one rooted in Christian duty. He painted slavery as a burden he bore for the good of society, a sacred arrangement where each person knew their place. His neighbors nodded along, grateful not to look too closely at the cracks. But beneath the perfume, there was always the stench of iron shackles. The beauty of the lawn came from backs bent in the sun. The polished silver had been scrubbed until fingers bled. Even the hymns carried upstairs were sung by voices forbidden to leave the property. The cruel genius of the system was that it looked almost ordinary to outsiders. A visitor could sip tea in the Grayson parlor and believe they were witnessing harmony, when just beyond the window children were being bartered like calves. To maintain the illusion, William spoke of his slaves as family, as though affection balanced ownership. Elias, ever the accountant, spoke of efficiency, as though numbers erased grief. Together they convinced others, and perhaps even themselves, that their wealth was not built on brutality, but on providence. And yet, those forced to live within this cage knew the truth. Rebecca knew the truth. The gilding could not hide the bars. Every polished surface, every practiced smile, only sharpened her awareness of the trap closing around her children. And once that mask began to crack, the horror beneath would no longer be containable. Now, I want you to walk with me through the Grayson plantation, not as a guest on the porch, but as one of the unseen, one of the enslaved whose footsteps left no record. The land stretched wide, cotton fields rolling out like a white sea under the sun. At first glance, it seemed endless, a promise of prosperity. But look closer, and you would see the truth. Hunched bodies moving in rhythm, hands blistered and raw, songs sung low enough not to anger the overseer. The fields were not just fields. They were cages without walls, where sweat marked time more cruelly than any clock. At the edge of the property stood the slave quarters, rows of rough cabins, their wood split and warped by years of rain. Inside, the air was heavy with smoke from small fires, the faint smell of cornmeal, and the quiet breathing of families packed into spaces meant to hold livestock. The walls seemed to listen. They had absorbed lullabies, whispered prayers, and muffled cries for generations. Then there was the whipping post, planted firm in the dirt like some dark altar. Its presence haunted everything. Even when silent, it hummed with memory, with the echo of screams and the sting of lashes carried on the wind. And above it all loomed the big house. Its whitewashed walls gleamed in the sun, a beacon of authority, towering over everything else. Its windows were watchful eyes, its doors thresholds of fear. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to remind Rebecca and the others of where they stood, not as people, but as possessions. This was the infrastructure: wood, iron, fields, and ledgers, all bound together in one living machine. It breathed oppression, it pulsed with control, and every brick, every board, every chain seemed designed to remind Rebecca that escape was impossible. But the truth was, no cage is truly unbreakable, not forever. Have you ever noticed how cruelty, when wrapped in enough words, can begin to sound almost reasonable? That was the great trick of men like William and Elias Grayson. They didn't just commit horrors. They dressed them in explanations so polished, so rehearsed, that outsiders rarely questioned them. When visitors asked why children were crying near the quarters, William would smile and say, "They're learning discipline. It's for their own good." His voice carried the certainty of a father correcting his household, and no one dared press further. When bruises appeared on the backs of men in the fields, Elias could produce neat ledgers, pointing to quotas, to laziness, punished for the sake of efficiency. It was never cruelty, he insisted. It was business, science, the maintenance of order. Even the pulpit was not free from this corruption. The Graysons leaned heavily on scripture, citing verses that spoke of servants obeying their masters, twisting holy words into chains. The plantation chapel rang with hymns of mercy, while just outside, mercy was nowhere to be found. And society, the neighbors, the courts, the merchants who bought their cotton, nodded in agreement. To question the Graysons' logic was to threaten not only their wealth, but the entire fragile illusion of Southern honor. But for Rebecca, these explanations were poison. She saw them for what they were: lies stacked on lies, justifications that asked the world to look away while her family was slowly dismantled. Every time she heard William quote scripture, every time Elias explained away another cruelty with numbers, it only deepened her quiet fury. The system could excuse bruises, it could excuse hunger, it could even excuse the sale of husbands. But when William turned those same cold justifications toward her children, Rebecca understood something chilling. There was no explanation left that could save them. Every empire of cruelty has its willing hands, the ones who may not design the system, but who keep it running day after day. On the Grayson plantation, that role belonged to Isaac Bell, the overseer. Isaac was not born wealthy. He came from a poor white family, the kind who scraped a living from thin soil and counted every penny. To him, the overseer's job was a rare chance to climb above his station. It gave him authority. Men who once would have ignored him now tipped their hats. His word could decide a whipping, a ration, even whether someone lived to see morning. For a man who had grown up invisible, that power was intoxicating. But beneath Isaac's hardened exterior, there was conflict. He wasn't blind. He saw the suffering, the families ripped apart, the children clinging to their mothers at auction blocks. At night, alone, he sometimes drank until his conscience blurred. He told himself he was just doing his job, that if it wasn't him, someone else would take the whip. That small lie, that dangerous excuse, was how he survived his own reflection. And yet, the truth is this: Isaac's fear outweighed his guilt. He feared poverty more than he pitied Rebecca. He feared William Grayson's wrath more than he feared his own soul. So, he kept the books of punishment, swung the lash when ordered, and turned his back when mercy might have whispered otherwise. In the theater of oppression, Isaac was no lead villain, but he was the stagehand who kept the show alive. Without men like him, William and Elias Grayson's empire would have crumbled. And to Rebecca, that made him just as dangerous, because complicity, whispered through silence and obedience, is often the cruelest chain of all. And soon, Isaac would find himself standing closer to Rebecca's fury than he ever expected. Before tragedy struck, they were simply a family. That is the part history so often forgets. Rebecca rose before dawn each day, not because she wished to, but because survival demanded it. Still, in those quiet moments before the overseer's call, she tried to preserve something sacred. She would whisper a prayer over her children, smoothing Samuel's hair as he stirred, pulling Mary close into the crook of her arm. These moments, fleeting, fragile, were her rebellion. Love, in a world built to crush it, was resistance itself. Samuel, at 12, had the beginnings of his father's strength. His hands were calloused already, though he was still just a boy. He watched everything, listened carefully, and asked questions Rebecca sometimes couldn't answer. He carried both hope and dread in his chest, old enough to sense the danger that lurked in every adult conversation. Mary was only 7, her laughter high and quick, a spark that lit the dimmest room. She loved to hum while she worked, stringing together snatches of song she heard from the elders, her small voice softening the edge of each long day. Rebecca clung to that sound, knowing it might not last forever. And then there was Thomas, Rebecca's husband, her anchor. He carried himself with quiet dignity, despite the chains, despite the endless fields. He whispered dreams to her at night, that one day their children might grow where no one owned them, that love might survive even here. His presence steadied her. His touch was proof that she was more than property, more than a number in Elias's ledger. Together, they carved out a kind of life within the shadows. Their laughter was hushed, their joys stolen in small bursts, but they were real. They mattered. But outside their cabin walls, the world did not see a family. It saw labor, it saw profit, it saw bodies for sale. And when the Graysons decided to break them apart, they believed they were shattering only property. They forgot they were tearing apart hearts that loved as fiercely as any in the world. Sometimes, the first cracks in a fortress appear not from a battering ram, but from a glance, a fleeting moment when someone sees what was never meant to be seen. On the Grayson plantation, that moment belonged to Clara. Clara was another enslaved woman, older than Rebecca, her body worn by years of labor in the fields. She was quiet, careful with her words, the kind of person who learned long ago that silence was the only safe companion, but silence does not make one blind. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Clara was sent to carry a message to the big house. She walked softly up the steps, her eyes lowered as custom demanded. But before she could knock, she heard voices spilling through the half-open door. William's voice, sharp with anger, and Elias's, flat and calculating. She froze. "Thomas is gone, sold to Mississippi," Elias said, his tone like he was noting the price of a mule. "And the woman?" William's voice followed, harder. "She'll do as she's told. If not, the children will remind her what's at stake." Clara's breath caught. For a moment, the world seemed to still, the cicadas, the wind, even the pounding of her own heart. She had stumbled onto a conversation not meant for her ears, one that carried within it the destruction of Rebecca's world. Carefully, she slipped back down the steps, every creak of the wood sounding like thunder. She did not tell the Graysons what she had overheard. She told Rebecca. And in that hushed confession, whispered by lamplight in the quarters, the fragile thread holding Rebecca's world together began to unravel. Because now, it was no longer just grief. It was threat. It was children. And that knowledge could not be unheard. The facade of order was cracking. And behind it, Rebecca's fury was beginning to take shape. When Clara whispered the truth to Rebecca, the air in the quarters changed. It was as though the walls themselves had heard it, as though the dirt beneath their feet shuddered with dread. Thomas was gone. The children were next. Rebecca's face remained composed, but her eyes told Clara she had unleashed something that could never be caged again. But secrets never stayed quiet for long on the plantation. The next day, Isaac Bell, the overseer, came to the quarters with orders. Clara was missing from the fields, summoned instead to the big house. The others knew what that meant. Questions, accusations, and the kind of punishments designed to erase both truth and courage. William Grayson confronted her not with rage, but with that cold, paternal calm he wielded like a blade. "You must have misunderstood," he said, pacing slowly, his voice smooth as oil. "Thomas wasn't sold. He was relocated, for his own good. And as for the children, why would I harm what belongs to me?" His smile never touched his eyes. When Clara hesitated, when her silence betrayed what she knew, the punishment came swiftly. She was whipped, not to correct her labor, but to correct her memory. Every lash was meant as a warning. Truth would be beaten out until only the official story remained. By the time she was dragged back to the quarters, her back was a map of scars, her lips sealed shut. The Graysons spread their own explanation. That Clara had been caught stealing, that the discipline was necessary. Neighbors nodded, overseers looked away, and the system carried on as if nothing had been revealed. But Rebecca did not forget. She could not. Clara's broken body was proof that silence was survival, but also proof that survival under such a system was no life at all. And in the quiet of that night, Rebecca began to imagine the unthinkable, not endurance, but defiance. Rumors have a way of slipping past even the tightest walls. Clara's screams, the marks carved into her back, the sudden absence of Thomas. These things could not remain invisible forever. In the county, whispers began to spread. A merchant who once traded with Elias remarked on Thomas's sudden disappearance. A traveling preacher passing through noted the bruises on Clara's body. Even among the enslaved on neighboring plantations, stories flickered like sparks carried on the wind. And so, inevitably, there was a question. A small one, almost casual. A county official rode up one morning, dust clinging to his coat, asking William Grayson if perhaps, just perhaps, there had been trouble on the plantation. William welcomed him with charm. He ushered him inside, offered him coffee in a polished cup, spoke with the calm authority of a man who had nothing to hide. Thomas, he explained, had been sent ahead to prepare land for expansion in Mississippi. Clara's punishment? Regrettable but necessary. Theft, laziness, disobedience. He produced every excuse that society already accepted. Elias stepped in with numbers, ledgers, contracts. His voice was steady, his handwriting neat, each page designed to transform suffering into statistics. To men like the county official, numbers spoke louder than bruises, ink weighed more than blood. By the end of the visit, the inquiry was over before it had truly begun. The official tipped his hat, reassured by William's composure, lulled by Elias's orderliness. Outside, the enslaved looked on, their eyes filled with quiet despair. They knew what had happened. They knew what was coming. But their voices carried no weight in a world deaf to their humanity. Rebecca, though, was watching. She saw how easily truth had been dismissed, how quickly justice had bowed its head. If even inquiry could be silenced, then there was no authority left to protect her family. And so the fragile illusion of hope collapsed, leaving only the fire of resistance to take its place. There are some wounds that cannot be hidden. No polished words, no ledgers, no scripture can erase them. They walk into the room with you. They breathe beside you. They become living evidence of horror. Clara was that evidence. Weeks after her whipping, she moved like a shadow, her back stiff, her steps careful. The scars, raised and angry, ran across her skin like brands, not just marks of punishment, but permanent testimony. Every time she reached for a bucket or bent to gather wood, her body winced. No amount of silence could erase the truth carved into her flesh. And then there were the children. Samuel and Mary, once lively in their small ways, seemed to wither under the weight of their father's absence. Samuel stopped asking questions. His eyes grew sharper, older, as though he had seen too much too soon. Mary clung to her mother, her laughter thinning into nervous hums, her small body trembling when William passed too close. Their grief was unspoken, but it lingered in their movements, in the way they sought Rebecca's arms at night, as if the world itself was threatening to tear them away. Rebecca carried these living proofs within her sight every day. Clara's scars, Samuel's silence, Mary's trembling. They were constant reminders that what the Graysons did could never be explained away. Each face, each wound, was undeniable evidence that the system was not order, but destruction. For outsiders, it was easy to nod along with William's excuses, to be soothed by Elias's numbers. But for Rebecca, there was no escaping the raw, human cost that stared back at her in the quarters each night. And with each passing day, as she traced her children's faces in the dim glow of the fire, she felt the truth sharpen within her like a blade. If she did nothing, they would not survive this place. But if she acted, if she dared, her resistance might cost her everything. Cruelty, in the hands of men like the Graysons, was not chaos, it was calculation. Every punishment, every sale, every threat was part of a method, a system refined through years of breaking bodies and bending wills. William's method was psychological. He believed fear was more efficient than constant violence. He measured his punishments carefully, ensuring they were public enough to remind others, yet controlled enough to avoid rebellion. He cultivated uncertainty. No one ever knew when the lash might fall or why. That unpredictability was his weapon. Better they stay guessing, he once told Isaac Bell, than think themselves safe. Elias's method was arithmetic. To him, enslaved men, women, and children were entries in a ledger, investments to be maximized. He studied their labor outputs, adjusted rations to the bare minimum required for survival, and calculated profits from sales as though moving coins across a table. He did not need to raise his voice or strike a blow. His cruelty was quieter, but no less monstrous. With a single line of ink, he could erase a family, sending husbands to Mississippi, children to Louisiana, wives left behind to grieve in silence. Even their tools reflected this machinery. The whip, coiled neatly on Isaac's belt, was not just leather, it was strategy, always visible, always waiting. The auction block was polished, its wood worn smooth from countless feet, a silent monument to commerce. The slave cabins themselves were placed in rows within sight of the big house, a daily reminder of who ruled and who obeyed. This was not random brutality. It was a system, a machine built to strip away hope, to grind resistance into dust, to turn human beings into resources. And within that system, Rebecca realized something chilling. The Graysons did not see themselves as villains at all. They saw themselves as masters of order. And in their twisted logic, her love, her family, her very will to protect, were nothing more than obstacles to be controlled. But monsters, no matter how methodical, always overlook one truth. Even the most broken cage can still give birth to defiance. Up until now, Rebecca had endured. She had bent beneath the weight of the Graysons' power, carried her grief in silence, and shielded her children as best she could. But endurance has its limits. There comes a moment when silence is no longer safety, when obedience no longer protects. For Rebecca, that moment had arrived. Every scar on Clara's back, every restless night in the quarters, every hollow look in her children's eyes had burned themselves into her memory. Each was a message. They will take everything if you let them. Rebecca's crusade did not begin with a rallying cry or a speech. It began in whispers, whispered prayers by the fire, whispered words of reassurance to Samuel and Mary, whispered promises to herself that she would not let her family vanish into the ledger's ink. Her strength was not loud. It was deliberate, carved out of quiet resolve. Unlike the men who saw themselves as rulers, Rebecca had no illusions of grandeur. She did not fight for wealth or power. She fought for something they had never valued. Love, the love of a husband torn from her arms, the love of 2 children trembling in the shadow of the whip, the love of a life that deserved to be lived free from the crushing hand of men who treated souls like coin. And that love hardened into defiance. Rebecca's crusade was not for history books or courts of law. It was for survival, for dignity, for one last chance to say, "I am not yours to destroy." The world would not name her a hero. But in the stillness of the Alabama night, she became one anyway. And as the walls closed in, she began to prepare for the moment when endurance would transform into resistance. Rebecca knew she could not strike blindly. To resist, she had to understand. To protect her children, she had to move like shadow, silent and unseen, inside the very system that sought to crush her. So she began to watch, carefully, patiently. Every gesture, every habit of the Graysons became a thread in the web she was spinning. She noticed how William carried his pistol, tucked carelessly in his belt when he strode across the yard, arrogance making him sloppy. She memorized the times when Elias locked his ledgers away and when he grew distracted with drink. She tracked Isaac Bell's movements, how he patrolled after nightfall but always drifted back toward the quarters of his own choosing, his loyalty diluted by lust. She even mapped the rhythms of the household. When the lamps flickered low in the parlor, when the sound of laughter echoed from the dining table, when silence fell heavy over the big house. These were not just observations, they were weapons waiting to be sharpened. At night, while her children slept curled against her, Rebecca lay awake rehearsing possibilities in her mind. She imagined escape routes through the trees, hiding places for her children if danger came. She studied the kitchen knives, the iron tools, the stones near the well. In her silence, she became an investigator, an architect of her own fragile plan. And always, her heart beat with the knowledge that discovery meant death, not only for her, but for Samuel and Mary. One wrong glance, one misstep, and the Graysons' wrath would fall like fire. Yet the risk only steeled her further, for Rebecca was no longer simply surviving. She was learning, she was preparing, and the Graysons, secure in their power, never realized that their routines were being read, their weaknesses marked, their empire studied by the very woman they thought broken. Now, stop for a moment. I want you to imagine what it would feel like. Your husband torn from your arms, your children's safety hanging by a thread, your every breath monitored by men who call you property. Imagine lying awake at night, planning not dreams, but survival. That was Rebecca's world. And if you're still here with me, if you're still listening, then you've stepped inside her struggle. This isn't just history. It's an investigation, and you're a part of it now. Because stories like Rebecca's were buried, silenced, erased by those who wanted power without consequence. But here we are, dragging them back into the light. And if her courage matters to you, if you believe her voice should never be lost again, then join me. Share this story, subscribe to this channel, and help us fight against the silence. You are not just a viewer, you are a witness, and together we refuse to let Rebecca's last resistance be forgotten. Some moments brand themselves into memory so deeply that they change the course of a life. For Rebecca, that moment came in the dim light of Elias Grayson's study. She had been ordered inside to clean, to dust the ledgers and polish the wooden shelves. Elias, careless after an evening of drink, had left one of his great record books open on the desk. Rebecca's eyes flickered to the pages, and there it was. Names, columns, values. Her husband Thomas, reduced to a figure in neat handwriting, marked as sold, Natchez, Mississippi, January 1834. But what froze her breath was not Thomas's name alone. Beneath it, written in Elias's tidy script, was a chilling notation. Samuel Mary, potential assets for future sale. Her children. Listed not as her babies, not as human souls, but as currency waiting to be cashed. Rebecca's hands trembled. She closed the book quickly, but the words burned in her mind like fire. Every fear, every whisper of dread had been confirmed in ink. They would take her children. Not if, but when. That night, as the others slept, she sat awake in the quarters, staring into the faint glow of the dying fire. The ledger's truth weighed heavier than any chain. She realized then that the Graysons were not going to stop. They would not rest until everything she loved was carved into their arithmetic. And so Rebecca made her choice. The time for watching was over. The moment of resistance had arrived. The evidence was undeniable, and now, so was her resolve. The night Rebecca chose to act was thick with heat, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and pine. Every sound seemed amplified, the chirp of crickets, the distant bark of dogs, the creak of the boards beneath her bare feet. She moved like a shadow, guiding Samuel and Mary through the narrow path that led away from the quarters. Each step was measured, every breath held like a fragile secret. She had hidden small scraps of food, a broken flask of water, and the knife she had taken from the kitchen. Not much, but enough to begin. Her plan was simple. Reach the tree line, move through the swamp under cover of darkness, and find refuge among the free black communities she had heard whispers about. But plans are brittle things under the weight of power. Isaac Bell noticed their absence before dawn, his instincts sharpened by years of hunting men and women who tried to flee. By the time the Graysons were roused, the dogs were already straining at their leashes, the overseer's whip snapping as he shouted orders. Rebecca pushed the children forward, heart pounding, ears filled with the chaos of pursuit behind them. Branches tore at her arms, mud sucked at her feet, but still she ran. Each cry of the dogs drew closer, each shout echoing through the night. This was no longer escape, it was survival, pressed tight against the edge of capture. And somewhere deep inside, Rebecca knew, when the chase reached its breaking point, resistance would be her only weapon left. The swamp gave way to open ground just as the first traces of dawn split the sky. Rebecca stumbled into a narrow road, Samuel clinging to her hand, Mary pressed against her side. Civilization was close now. Not freedom, not safety, but the edge of a world where secrecy could no longer protect the Graysons. Behind her, the baying of dogs cut through the morning air. Isaac Bell was closing in, his voice rising in cruel triumph. "You can't run, girl. Nowhere to go." His words echoed off the trees, but Rebecca pressed forward, her breath ragged, her body aching. She had reached the threshold where fear becomes fire. At the crossroads stood a wagon, its driver a poor farmer hauling goods to market. He froze at the sight, a mother with two terrified children, mud-stained and desperate, fleeing from mounted men with whips and rifles. For the first time, the chase was no longer hidden in the dark heart of the plantation. It was visible, undeniable, witnessed. Isaac leapt from his horse, closing the distance. Rebecca gripped the knife, every nerve taut, ready to fight. She knew what would happen if they were dragged back. The ledger's prophecy would be fulfilled, her children sold, her body broken. But here, on this dusty road, under the widening eyes of strangers, the Graysons' empire of silence cracked. Because once a truth escapes into the open, no whip, no ledger, no charm can force it back into shadow. It began with murmurs, then questions, then demands. That farmer's terrified testimony carried to town faster than the Graysons could suppress it. Within days, county men rode out, not with reverence, but with suspicion heavy in their eyes. William, still cloaked in charm, welcomed them with forced civility. Elias clutched his ledgers like scripture. Isaac hovered nearby, hand on whip, jaw tight. But this time, their words faltered against what could not be hidden. The men were led through the plantation grounds, through the neat facade of white columns and polished floors, and then into the shadows behind. The cabins, cramped and airless, reeked of sweat and sickness. Chains rattled faintly from where they hung on pegs. Clara was brought forward, her back bared by trembling hands, the scars rising like a testimony no ledger could erase. Eyes widened. Silence pressed heavy. One officer pulled open a cellar door, his lantern cutting through the dark. What it revealed was worse than rumor. A narrow chamber where runaways had been shackled, the stone walls stained, the floor littered with rusted manacles. It was not order. It was a dungeon. The Graysons sputtered explanations. Discipline, necessity, God's will. But the air itself seemed to reject their lies. The plantation, stripped of its polish, stood naked as a machine of terror. For Rebecca, watching from the shadows with her children, it was confirmation. The chamber of horrors was no longer a secret. The world had glimpsed it. And once seen, such truths cannot be unseen. They rot the mask, and they demand reckoning. In the weeks that followed the raid, the Graysons found themselves dragged into a theater they could not control, the court of public opinion. Once, William Grayson had been the man neighbors admired, the gentleman planter with a fine house and a silver tongue. Elias, the responsible brother, had been praised for his orderliness, his keen arithmetic. Even Isaac Bell, brutal as he was, had been spoken of with grudging respect as a man who kept discipline. But now, the whispers in town had teeth. People spoke of chains in the cellar, scars on women's backs, children listed in ledgers like cattle. The farmer's testimony spread like wildfire. The officials' findings traveled further still. The Graysons, once pillars of Southern respectability, were suddenly names muttered with unease. At church, pews that once welcomed them grew cold. Merchants who once extended credit now hesitated. Women who once nodded politely in the market turned their faces away. The Graysons protested, of course. William insisting on slander, Elias invoking the sanctity of commerce, Isaac threatening anyone who dared repeat the rumors. But the cracks were visible. For the enslaved who had endured their cruelty, the sight was bitterly satisfying. Masters, stripped not by the lash, but by truth itself. And for Rebecca, it was more than satisfaction. It was proof that monsters could bleed, not just in secret, but in the light of day. The Graysons were unmasked, and once the mask is torn away, even the proudest face cannot hide the stench beneath. It would have been comforting to believe the Graysons were alone, that their cruelty was the product of individual depravity. But the deeper the inquiry went, the more undeniable a larger truth became. The Graysons were not outliers. They were cogs in a sprawling machine. The ledgers Elias guarded so carefully told the story. Names flowed across state lines, traded like currency. One buyer in Natchez, another in New Orleans. Shipments of cotton marked for Charleston, then sent to New York, then across the ocean to Manchester, where factories hummed and fortunes grew. Every scar on Clara's back, every tear in Rebecca's eyes was tied to profit thousands of miles away. Banks in northern cities financed the mortgages that kept the Graysons afloat. Insurance companies underwrote the value of enslaved bodies as if they were barrels of sugar or bales of wheat. Ministers preached obedience from pulpits, wrapping the commerce of flesh in scripture. Even politicians in Washington defended men like William as the guardians of Southern order. The Graysons' cruelty was not an aberration. It was the system working exactly as designed. A global network where suffering was not a shameful secret, but the raw material of wealth and power. For Rebecca, the revelation was bitter but clarifying. She was not only fighting two brothers and their overseer, she was fighting the weight of a world built to erase her love, her family, her very existence. And yet, within that vast machinery, one act of resistance, one mother's defiance, could still strike like a hammer blow against its gears. At first, the revelations spread like wildfire. The raid, the chamber of horrors, the ledgers naming children as assets, all of it stirred outrage. But outrage has a short memory when it threatens the foundations of power. Neighbors who once whispered about the Graysons soon grew uneasy with their own reflections. If William and Elias were monsters, what did that say about those who dined at their table, who traded their cotton, who nodded in church as they prayed? To condemn the Graysons fully was to admit complicity, and complicity is a heavy mirror most men prefer not to face. So the whispers began to soften. Newspapers printed fewer lines. Officials shifted their attention elsewhere. Preachers spoke not of cruelty, but of order, warning congregations against division and outside agitation. Soon, the Graysons' sins were reframed as unfortunate excesses, regrettable but not unusual, best left unspoken for the sake of peace. And in that silence, Rebecca's act of resistance, her desperate defiance, was pushed to the shadows. The cruelty that had ignited her fight was folded back into normalcy, hidden beneath layers of forgetting. For the enslaved, the lesson was bitter but clear. Truth could be revealed, but it could also be buried. Power did not fear exposure half as much as it feared disruption, and so long as silence held, the machinery of bondage continued to turn. Because sometimes the most terrifying conspiracy is not a secret meeting in the dark, but the collective agreement to look away. History rarely delivers justice with the clarity we crave. The fates of the Graysons, their overseer, and Rebecca unfolded like the uneven ground of the Alabama earth, jagged, unsettled, and heavy with silence. William Grayson clung to his mask of respectability until his dying breath. Though his reputation never fully recovered, wealth insulated him. He died years later, in his own bed, surrounded by heirs who inherited not shame, but land and profit. For him, accountability came not from law, but only in the whispers that haunted his name. Elias retreated deeper into his numbers, his ledgers. After the scandal, he moved operations west, where fewer eyes watched and profit still thrived. He left behind a plantation scarred by cruelty, but found new soil willing to swallow it whole. His handwriting, cold, precise, lived longer than his remorse. Isaac Bell fared differently. Rumors dogged him. Some said he drank himself into ruin, others that he fell to violence, a man consumed by the very brutality he once wielded. His loyalty, once his weapon, became his curse. For without the Grayson's shadow to protect him, he was nothing but a thug in a world that had little patience for a discarded tool. And Rebecca? Her story fractures. Some whispered she was captured, her defiance smothered by the very system she had dared to challenge. Others believed she escaped into the swamps, vanishing into networks of resistance, her children at her side, her memory carried in secret songs. The truth? We may never know. But perhaps that is fitting. For Rebecca's fate is not measured by the records of her oppressors, but by the legacy of her defiance. And sometimes, survival itself, even whispered survival, is the sharpest form of justice. What does it mean to stand at the edge of despair and choose resistance? Rebecca's act, whether it ended in capture or escape, forces us to look directly into the shadow of human history and ask, what would we have done had we been in her place? The Graysons believed themselves masters, but their empire was built on fear, paper, and lies. Rebecca, stripped of every privilege, carried no wealth, no weapon but a kitchen knife, no shield but her love for her children. Yet her defiance shakes louder across time than the Graysons' fortunes ever could. Her story teaches us something chilling about power. It does not only corrupt those who hold it, it warps entire societies into silence, reshaping morality so cruelty becomes invisible, even ordinary. Neighbors looked away, banks profited, preachers blessed. That is the true horror, not just the lash, but the silence that surrounded it. And yet, Rebecca's shadow reveals something else, the unbreakable core of human dignity. Even when crushed beneath chains, even when every law, every scripture, every voice of authority declared her powerless, she found within herself a truth greater than their ledgers. That her children were not assets, that her love was not property, that her will could strike against the machine. We remember her not because she was written into their records, but because she slipped through their attempts to erase her. And her shadow asks us even now, when confronted with injustice, do we remain silent, or do we resist? So now we stand at the end of Rebecca's story, but endings are never neat, are they? Her life, her final act, dissolves into silence, into rumor, into fragments of memory, and yet that silence still speaks. Here's the question I cannot shake. Could this happen again today? Could families still be torn apart by a system that values profit over humanity? Could cruelty still hide behind polished faces, polite society, and official explanations? I know what you're thinking. We're better now. But history whispers otherwise. Whenever power goes unquestioned, whenever silence shields injustice, the shadows grow back. Different clothes, different names, the same machinery of control. Rebecca's resistance was not just about one plantation in Alabama. It was a warning written in blood and whispered through generations, and it demands something from us. Not passive listening, but response. Because if we forget her, if we smooth over her rage into something comfortable, then the Graysons win again. So I'll ask you directly, what do you see in Rebecca's shadow? Was she a criminal, or a mother defending her children with the only weapon left to her? And if you were in her place, with everything you love under threat, what would you have done? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because this is not the end. It never is. The next shadow waits just beyond the edge of the firelight. Another story, buried, denied, dangerous, and together, here at Echoes of Truth, we will drag it back into the open. But remember, the past never really sleeps. It lingers, watching, asking if you're ready for what comes next.